He's the lone Democrat in Utah's congressional delegation. Jim Matheson hopes to continue for another 2 years as the 2nd District's representative in Washington, D.C. Republican Morgan Philpot wants to dash that hope with his own win. Other Republicans have tried to beat Matheson and failed, but it's a year where incumbents face stiff challenges to re-election. Philpot believes he has the winning strategy. We'll hear from each candidate on this Election 2010 special. Hello, I'm Wes Sims, news director for KBYU FM. Our program this hour looks at Utah's 2nd Congressional District contest between incumbent Jim Matheson and Republican challenger Morgan Philpot. With me to help us understand the dynamics in that race is Professor Kelly Patterson, the director of the BYU Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy. Kelly, good to be working with you again on this program.
Thank you, Wes. Good to be here.
The 2nd Congressional District covers a lot of territory. It stretches from the northeast corner of the state by the Wyoming border all the way to the southwest corner of Utah's Dixie. Although it's mostly rural in geography, a large portion of heavily urbanized Salt Lake County finds itself within its borders, as does the St. George metro area. So it's a big district. Kelly, this is a year that Republicans are expected to really shine. How does this bode then for Jim Matheson as a Democrat trying to seek re-election to Congress?
I think it presents a challenge for him. As you noted, the district is quite large. It has this urban component, rural component, so it requires a candidate to be a bit ambidextrous at reaching out to both of those different constituencies. But I think the real issue is the frustration with Washington, D.C., and that frustration is boiling up across the country. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not the Utah voters take out that frustration they have with Washington, D.C. on Representative Matheson.
Well, let's take a look at the candidates. We're going to look first at the Republican candidate in the 2nd District race. Election 2010's Jake Taylor has this profile of Morgan Philpot.
Morgan Philpot is the Republican candidate for Utah's 2nd Congressional District. Where all other Republicans have failed, he says he is the man who will take down long-term incumbent Democrat Jim Matheson. What makes him different?
I think Morgan stands in stark contrast to a lot of politicians today in that it's not putting your finger up to the wind. I think he's paid the price to understand what good government means.
He's not a career politician. He's not the standard politician. I mean, he's a very down-to-earth guy.
Driving by Morgan Philpot's house, you'd have to look closely to see the sparse clues that it's home to a candidate for Congress. Philpot lives there with his wife, Natalie, and their 5 young children. The campaign trail takes up a lot of time, but whenever he can, Philpot tries to spend time with his kids.
New Kung Fu baby!
Right across the street from the Philpot home, the family has planted a good-sized garden. And as you can see, the Philpot family replaces just about every F with a PH. Morgan tries to use the Philpot farm to teach his own kids to enjoy a little hard work, something he had to do growing up.
He was raised by a mother with 7 children. His father left when he was really young, so he's worked hard his whole life.
Philpot has lived in the state since he came to the University of Utah, majoring in environmental studies and anthropology.
He's kind of adventurous, and he loved Indiana Jones growing up.
Just 2 years after graduating from the U, Philpot ran for and won a seat in the Utah House, representing Salt Lake District 45. After 2 terms there, Philpot went back to school, figuring a law degree would help him better provide for his growing family. Since returning from law school in Michigan, Philpot's decided that now is the time for him to become Utah's next representative in Congress. Despite enthusiasm, the Philpot camp understands that taking on Jim Matheson is a tough fight.
Yeah, it is a bit of David and Goliath.
That was reporter Jake Taylor's profile of Republican Morgan Philpot, who is running to unseat Representative Jim Matheson in Utah's 2nd Congressional District. And right now we're pleased to welcome Mr. Philpot to the KBYU studios. We're happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let me start off by asking you, congressional elections are all about whether the incumbent is doing his job. Why should voters in the 2nd Congressional District replace Jim Matheson with you?
Well, I think that is the exact question. Is the incumbent doing his job? And you look over the last 2 years, even over the last 10 years, and what's happening in America, and there's obviously a level of discontent, perhaps like we've never seen before. And instead of doing what Congress should have done, which was really rein in spending, balance their budgets, they have gone on a spending spree, raising our debt ceiling by very large amounts, $2 trillion just in the last 2 years. Stimulus spending versus very successful patterns of economic stimulus in America's past through tax cuts and reducing budgets. And I think what we're seeing is just a lack of political will in Washington, D.C. to really fix the problem. So the reason to elect a Morgan Philpot is a person that you know through his previous voting record is going to go in and fight to balance budgets and rein in spending.
Let's talk about voting records for a minute, because as Wes asked, this is about whether or not the incumbent deserves your election to some extent. What votes has Representative Matheson cast that specifically you would not have cast?
Right. I would start with raising the debt ceiling. In his time in office, he's raised it by over $4 trillion. Stimulus spending is another one. He voted to spend $787 billion, money that we didn't have, money that really is heaped upon our children and our children's children to pay for Washington, D.C. spending habits. You could go to cash for clunkers. He voted against producing a budget this year, one of the first times that that's happened in decades. And the list goes on. So I think that's where I would start and say, going into the future, we need to kind of flip that on its head and put somebody in D.C. who's actually going to vote to balance a budget, produce a budget, and vote for real economic stimulus.
So some of these votes that you would have cast differently did bring back stimulus dollars back to the state of Utah. They did provide funds for individuals to upgrade their car, improve the air quality in the environment. Those were the stated goals, anyway, of the Cash for Clunkers program, to which you've made reference. So what are the one or two priorities that you would make, and how do you balance those priorities? Spending is important for the state's economy at some level. So how do you kind of balance these priorities?
Well, I think it goes back again to what has worked in America's past and what has not. Spending your way out of debt does not work. It's not fair to our children. It's not fair to future generations to continue spending money we don't have. So it may be that person A received a benefit to buy a car, but persons B, C, D, and E are funding that. And in some points it's going to be person B, C, D, and E's children who are paying for your Cash for Clunkers benefit. So again, let's go back to ideas that have really worked. Under Reagan, under Gingrich, where they sought to cut taxes and reduce federal spending. Now, where we see a combination of both, real reduction in federal spending and real tax cuts, continuous, permanent tax cuts, I think that's where you see real economic stimulus and you see the economy take off.
But what about those government priorities? For example, space exploration that truly benefit the industry here in the state of Utah, but is federally funded. Are those the kinds of cuts you would argue for in order to balance the budget? Because it's the same principle, right? Asking person A, B, or C to pay for the jobs of D, E, and F, right?
There are certain appropriations that can be made through the federal government that are appropriate, constitutional appropriations that make sense. But when you're in an economic recession and you try to take money that we don't have and make the deficit and the debt worse, that's when you really get yourself into trouble. What we ought to look at doing is fixing the economy, the American economy first, and then let's look again at elevating our sights upwards towards space exploration, space infrastructure. If we don't do that, we've got a 75-year outlook in America where we can only afford 4 things: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt. So if you ever want to have military spending or appropriate infrastructure spending, we've got to get our fiscal situation under control right now, or we're going to see all of that stuff go by the wayside.
Let's talk about bipartisanship and civility in Congress. Most observers note that there is not the friendly relationship between members of opposition parties that there used to be. The Republicans have been dubbed the party of no. If you were elected to Congress from the 2nd District, would you try to establish friendly relationships with some Democrats in order to get things passed in Congress?
Absolutely. I think the problem in Washington, D.C. is not necessarily bipartisanship anymore. It's a wholesale agreement to compromise American principles. What we need to do is get Congress back on track, respecting the American people and respecting the principles that made us great. I think the people of Utah can appreciate that compromise in and of itself is not a virtue. None of us would ask our children to compromise their honesty or their integrity. We would ask them to hold true to those values 100% of the time. We need to ask Congress to do the same thing. We need to ask them to hold to the American principles 100% of the time.
Do you have an idea of who in the opposition party that you might be able to work with in Congress?
I would not limit it to any particular person. I literally would work with any single person who sets out to really restore some fiscal sanity in Washington, D.C.
So do you think the Congress works better when people doggedly hold to principles, or does Congress work better when individuals who are elected from different districts across the United States actually compromise on those principles to make sure that public policy gets passed that addresses problems? I mean, as you're talking about principles, the real problem there, or at least the harm that could follow, would be gridlock, deadlock.
Well, let's look at some of those principles. If we're talking about balancing your budget, I do think that our congressmen and women should doggedly hold to balancing a budget.
I wonder if that's over a 10-year or 15-year. I wonder if the Democrats want to balance their budget over a 15 or 20-year period, and Republicans have a bill that wants to balance that budget over 10 or 15 years. Where's the compromise there?
Right. See, and I would say that's more style than principle. Of course, I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said when it comes to style, bend in the wind, something like that. And for sure, absolutely we compromise when it comes to negotiating the way we achieve good ends. The problem is when you get a Congress, like the one we have right now, where the Speaker of the House can step up and say, you're going to have to pass this bill to know what's in it. That completely throws out the window principles of accountability and transparency and doesn't justify to the American people the extreme actions that are being taken right now in Washington, D.C.
You brought up Speaker Pelosi. She's been sort of a lightning rod in this year's midterm elections. Let's assume for a moment the Republicans do win control of the House of Representatives. You'll have a choice if you're elected to the House of Representatives and the Republicans win a majority in the House about a person to support for Speaker. Right now it seems like the two candidates are John Boehner from Ohio and Eric Cantor from Virginia. Which one of those would you support? And Utah is kind of a moderate district in and of itself. Is John Boehner too conservative for Utah principles? So I mean, you've got the same kinds of choices it seems
right.
to make as some of these other Democrats have made.
I actually lean towards somebody off that list completely, a guy named Congressman Paul Ryan out of Wisconsin. And the reason I admire Paul Ryan is his willingness, his courage to actually step forward and present a plan. And you may not like his plan, you may not agree with it 100%, but the political courage that he shows to actually step up in front of the American people and say, look, we've got a real problem. We've got a sustainability problem, a fiscal solvency problem. And he says, look, here's what we can do to fix it. I admire that, and that's the kind of person I want to get behind in Washington, D.C.
So it's not Representative Boehner or Representative Cantor, it's Representative Ryan.
Unfortunately for them, no.
And so, but in a vote for Speaker, let's assume now that Representative Ryan doesn't win the race for a leader in his party. He's not put up on the docket as someone who's going to be voted upon for Speaker. In that case, do you support Representative Boehner or Representative Cantor?
Is there a write-in option? If there's a write-in option,
normally there's not a write-in option for Speaker.
So if it comes down to Pelosi versus Boehner, I'm going to take Boehner. If it comes down to Pelosi versus Cantor, I'm going to take Cantor. If I have to choose between Cantor and Boehner to decide who goes to face Pelosi, for example, or because I'm not sure if they do the runoff the way we did it here in Utah, but I imagine that the Democrats vote for a Democrat and the Republicans vote for a Republican. I'll vote for the Republican over Nancy Pelosi.
What kinds of committee positions would you seek? What assignments on committees would you seek if you were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives?
I would like to be on resources. and the reason I want to be on resources is we need a lands champion in Utah. I've been in rural Utah a good majority of my time running for office, and they need some help. They need somebody who's ready to stand up and really fight for their local control and access over Utah's lands.
Immigration has become really a hot-button issue, with Arizona passing its own form of immigration law, saying that the federal government has failed. Legislators in Utah are saying the same thing. If you're a member of Congress, what kind of immigration reform would you be pushing for?
I think, first of all, you've got to take amnesty off the table. And the other side of that spectrum is you've also got to take mass deportation off the table. Neither one are going to work. Neither one respects both mercy and justice. What I think you do is you take amnesty off the table, you secure the border, because we've got some real problems on the border today. Once we do that, we can then look at taking away incentives for illegal immigration. Once we've taken away those incentives, we can begin to penalize employers who employ, and we can begin to make the immigration process into America easier, and we can make work visas easier to get.
You mentioned securing the border. How would you do that? We've had discussion about a wall, greater enforcement. Do you see a way to actually make that happen?
I think it's got to be a combination of your traditional military, and I hate to use the word military because it sounds so, I don't know, East German, right? But there's got to be a way where we can use older styles of fencing with modern day technology and modern day intelligence, because we've got problems with human trafficking, drug trafficking, crime, coyotes who are smuggling people across the border, and they're the main means of trying to get people across the border. So it's not going to just be building a fence. It's got to be a combination of, I think, fences, cameras, intelligence, men on the ground, and updating our points of entry. Again, though, I don't know if a lot of securing the borders, if securing the border in and of itself is enough. I don't think it is. I think you've got to combine that with also taking away the incentives for illegal immigration, cracking down on employers. But to really justify cracking down on employers, you've also got to create an easier pathway into America from the outside. You've got to make it easier for our agricultural industry to get the work visas they need. And I think if you do all of those things in concert, the border will be easier to secure.
Do you favor a constitutional amendment that would deny citizenship, automatic citizenship, to children of illegal immigrants who were born in the United States?
Essentially changing the 14th Amendment?
I think that the 14th Amendment was always intended to do that. I think birthright citizenship is actually a corruption of the 14th Amendment. When you go back and you look at the debates surrounding the 14th Amendment, the author himself made it fairly clear that it was not intended to cover those born to people illegally in the United States.
So then you favor a constitutional amendment that would kind of enshrine that interpretation of the 14th Amendment, especially when it's been interpreted so very differently over the last 100 years, 150 years. I mean, is that kind of where you're going?
No, I don't think we need a constitutional amendment. I think we need to go back to following the rule of law, which is looking at legislative intent to define the meaning of a statute or a constitutional amendment. What we need to do is interpret it correctly and quit granting birthright citizenship to those who come here illegally. That doesn't, however, fix the problem of all those who are already here, who have already been given citizenship. And that takes us back to a discussion of mercy and justice. It's a little bit hard to say that justice demands that they leave when we made the law which allowed them to become citizens.
Wouldn't that proper interpretation, as you put it, of the 14th Amendment have to come through the Supreme Court?
Possibly. And again, if the Supreme Court follows sort of traditional statutory interpretation, it would be to look at that legislative intent. And that's pretty clear when you go back and read the words of the sponsor himself on that amendment.
Midterm elections are often seen as a referendum on the performance of the president holding office. Can you say whether or not you approve or disapprove the job President Obama's done? What do you approve of? What do you disapprove of?
I have plenty of philosophical differences with the president, but even if I pick just a couple, maybe one or two, I would say healthcare reform. A government takeover of the healthcare system was not the answer. Two, trying to spend our way out of debt rather than balance budgets and cut spending would be two of my biggest complaints.
Is there anything that he's done that you would approve of?
Boy, that's
You're talking about
significant
you talked about deficit in health care probably is the driving force behind a lot of the anger and frustration you see among voters and some of the candidates running for public office this year. But anything that he's done you would approve of? Conduct of the war in Afghanistan?
Again, not one that I'm very impressed with. I don't think the American people understand why we're still there, whether or not we're still pursuing the mission for which we entered Afghanistan. I think that needs to be made more clear to the American people. One of the problems I think the president's going to have, and this is my problem in perhaps heaping praise upon him right now, is he has had the House and the Senate by which he could accomplish some change. And I think he's fallen a little too victim to political rhetoric, promising big and not delivering, which is always a danger when you have control of those three bodies.
President Obama's come out, though, for extending the Bush tax cuts for individuals who make less than $250,000 a year. Is that your position as well? So is that one area you can agree upon?
And I appreciate that, but he has also very heavily criticized those who make over $250,000 without really being honest about who's making over $250,000 a year, which is a lot of small businesses who register as individuals. I think what he needs to do is, if he really believes in making those tax cuts permanent, he should have been out before the recess, and he should have been really driving that issue home because they were important for economic certainty. We really needed those Bush tax cuts extended before Congress adjourned. Again, I would point to his failure to lead out on that issue, to really rein in the Speaker and the President on that issue, and my opponent, who voted to adjourn, is the key vote to punt that issue to a lame duck Congress.
All right, let's go back to a couple of issues you've talked about. This will be our last question. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I'd really like you to give our audience a sense of how you actually balance this deficit reduction versus the kind of government intervention in the economy necessary to avoid more economic meltdown. This seems to be the choice that economists say we're faced with. Stiglitz, Krugman, some of the others have said this isn't the time to cut the deficit, whereas you seem to say this is the time to cut the deficit. How do you walk that fine line between government intervention in the economy but reducing the deficit over the long haul?
Well, I think it speaks to an issue that Congress has not been good at over time, and that's reliability and consistency. Realizing that, yes, we may not be able to cut the deficit immediately down to a balanced budget, but if we would have stopped spending at certain points in time and really perhaps reformed the appropriations process and made a more responsible appropriations process, something more similar to what we do here in Utah, where we ask everybody to begin to analyze their budgets through appropriations committees rather than one big powerful appropriations committee. And we disseminate the effect, and then they return and tell us where they can take 5%. And we begin over time to set that path, that course correction towards a balanced budget. Even if we stopped spending right now, we could balance our budget by 2016. So the problem is not whether or not the American economy can handle Congress, at least in the past. It's whether or not Congress can rein in their own spending before they break the back of the American economy.
Mr. Philpot, thank you for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Kelly, the Centers for the Study of Election Democracy has been doing polling around the state leading up to Tuesday's election, and you've asked people to tell you how favorably they feel about particular candidates. Representative Matheson's numbers seem to put him in a good position.
Yeah, he has very high favorables, which is always good for a candidate at this stage of the ball game. The real question is, do people vote party in his district, or do they vote personality? In years past, they voted his personality. This might be a year where they may vote party.
Well, how does Morgan Philpot then work against that favorability rating?
Well, once again, he's got to remind people that Representative Matheson, while he's been this moderate and effective representative, belongs to the wrong party. We heard him talk in his debate about Speaker Pelosi, and that's what you have to do. You have to get these Utah voters to think about the party and to come home to the Republican Party, because if they come home, they have a majority in that district.
We've already heard from Morgan Philpot. Let's now consider the other major party candidate in the 2nd Congressional District race, and that would be the incumbent, of course. Election 2010's Lauren Christensen prepared this profile of Representative Jim Matheson.
Jim Matheson, a 6th-generation Utahn and the state's lone Democratic congressman, is running for his 6th term in the U.S. House of Representatives. Politics is nothing new for Matheson. His interest in public service came from discussions around the family dinner table. His father, Scott Matheson, served as Utah's 12th governor from 1977 to 1985, leaving such an impact on the state that a major downtown courthouse was named after him.
This is something they talked about as a family when they were growing up, and talk about serving their community.
Jim was born in Salt Lake City, where he, his sister, and 2 brothers all attended Salt Lake Public Schools. Matheson continued his education, studying government at Harvard University, and he went on to earn a master's in business from UCLA. After college, Matheson spent more than a dozen years working for several energy companies in Utah, including his own firm. Matheson was first elected to Congress in 2000 and has held his seat despite the fact that he represents a predominantly red district. Those who know Matheson say his success comes because he's just a likable guy.
He doesn't have a big ego. He really is just he's kind of a normal guy that happened to run for office because he believed in serving his community, and he carries that sort of common sense, sort of regular kind of person attitude to Washington.
He goes out to get to know the people. And it's taken time, but he makes that commitment.
He's emphasized the kinds of issues that Utahns care about, particularly when it comes to radioactive waste issues, but certainly on a whole broad host of social issues. He's been where Utahns want him to be.
Matheson proclaims himself as a Utah Democrat. He has remained appealing to his largely conservative constituency by aligning himself with the Blue Dog Coalition, a group of fiscally conservative House Democrats. Matheson's career in the energy industry served as valuable experience when he was appointed to serve on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He currently lives in Salt Lake City with his wife Amy, who is a pediatrician, and their 2 sons William and Harris. Friends of the Mathesons say Jim's service is a sacrifice for the entire family.
He goes to Washington, D.C. every week. It's very hard to be in Washington part of the week and home on the weekends. One of the reasons why he does it is because he's got 2 small boys, and he wants to make this country better for them.
The family understands serving the community is a big priority for Jim, and they're behind him 100%.
Lauren Christensen prepared that report. Kelly, the Matheson name carries a lot of weight in Utah, going back a few years.
Going back to the years in which Representative Matheson's father was governor of the state of Utah. Visibility is really important in politics, and to be able to have that name and positive feelings associated with that name is a real resource.
Of course, that was back before Republicans really took over most of the political offices in Utah. That was before things changed.
Yeah, it was before the state became a one-party state. It was still fairly competitive back then, but now the registration advantage is overwhelmingly Republican.
Professor Patterson interviewed Jim Matheson a few days ago, and let's watch that interview now.
As you complete your 5th term in Congress, what would you say is the single biggest accomplishment that you would tout to voters of the 2nd Congressional District to make your case for re-election?
Boy, it's tough to limit it to one, but something I'm real proud of that happened this last Congress is that I moved legislation through the House of Representatives that bans the importation of foreign radioactive waste. It was a bipartisan vote, and I was real proud of the margin of vote. And I think that that effort has helped stop the waste from coming here. Admittedly, the Senate hasn't voted on it yet, but the company that was trying to pursue the application has withdrawn that effort. And it was just one of those circumstances where the policy was right, and in a bipartisan way, we got something done. So off the top of my head, that would be one I'd mention.
And was that the result of your being on that Energy and Commerce Committee? Was that quite helpful in the process, or would you probably been able to get that accomplished without membership on that committee?
I think that that there are a lot of factors that contribute to your success in Congress in terms of moving legislation, and committee assignments are one. But I would submit that maybe even a broader issue was the fact that we were able to pull together a bipartisan coalition. In this time where so much partisan bickering seems to dominate what's going on in Washington, the tried and true method for really getting something done is to build coalitions and have a bipartisan group that is on the same page. And in that environment, I think that's why I'm really proud that we were able to put together that type of coalition, and I think that's how we got it done.
What is the one word you would use to characterize your governing style or your representational style? If
I had to pick a word, I would say it's one of being a problem solver, which maybe that's a hyphenated. So you can tell me that's two words, but I'm going to count that as one.
How can you be a problem solver in an institution that seems to be so divided as the House of Representatives currently is?
I think it's all about being honest with people, and the reputation I have in the United States House of Representatives on both sides of the aisle is that I'm a very straight shooter, that I'm motivated by policy considerations. I don't let the politics drive my decisions. And so everybody knows on both sides of the aisle that this is a guy who's going to try to be a thoughtful person. And when you take that approach and you have that reputation, it gives you the ability to build coalitions. And it takes the partisan dynamic out of play. And a lot of issues in Congress actually do get addressed that are not that do not fall on party lines. They tend not to get all the attention because you don't have as much confrontation. And you know, the news channels like to show members of Congress screaming at each other. But there are times when very substantive and complicated issues do get addressed in a bipartisan way. I'll give one quick example. The United States Congress just passed legislation to reauthorize NASA. Boy, that's a complicated issue. And there are a lot of moving parts there. And in a bipartisan way, that went through the House and the Senate. No one ever heard about it because it didn't have that confrontation, and the confrontation seems to be what drives the media coverage of Washington. So there is too much partisan bickering, and there is too much of that confrontational attitude. But I have to say there's this whole book of business going on where that isn't the case, and I think that's how you can be effective.
Yeah, now, reauthorization of NASA is something very important for the country, obviously, but there are larger issues out there. There's a budget deficit, there are tax issues, there are entitlement programs. Can you honestly solve those kinds of problems in that partisan environment, or is that going to take generations?
I believe that if you look over history, when the United States Congress has made big decisions, big public policy decisions, it has almost always been in a bipartisan way. The big decisions have controversy, and the big decisions have complexity. And having the two parties come together and sort of lock arms, if you will, and take both the responsibility and the heat for making those big decisions, generally is the way things happen. 1983, Social Security was within weeks of being bankrupt. Ronald Reagan was the leading Republican as the president. Tip O'Neill was the leading Democrat as Speaker of the House. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did not agree on all issues, but two of them sat down over a matter of just a few weeks, and they hammered out a deal. And the deal secured Social Security for at least until the year 2041, if you listen to the current projections. Yeah, and that was done in a bipartisan way.
And do we have those kinds of leaders in Washington, D.C. now? I mean, is Speaker Pelosi a Speaker O'Neill? And are there adjustments that can be made, A, in leadership style, and B, in House organization that would foster this bipartisanship so you can get these kinds of monumental compromises?
I believe that both party leaderships have responsibility for encouraging a more cooperative atmosphere and working to build consensus, and neither set of leaders in either party has a very good track record as of late. So I would cast that net rather wide in terms of suggesting who has responsibility to make the institution work in a better way. You know, a line I heard a few months ago was, you know, bipartisanship requires the majority party to be inclusive, and it also requires the minority party to be constructive. And I believe right now we have a deficit in both of those dynamics right now in Washington. So I think it's on everybody to look for better behavior, and I'm pretty sure, in fact, I'm really sure that most people in America and most people in Utah want better behavior in Washington. They're tired of the bickering. I'm tired of the bickering. I'm part of a group that tries to take a different approach, and I think we need more people with my approach in Congress, because I think that's what most people, whether they're Democrats or Independents or Republicans, I think that's what people are looking for.
Okay. Let's talk about the Bush tax cuts. They're set to expire at the beginning of next year. What is the legislative prognosis for those tax cuts?
Well, they should have been extended a long time ago. We're in a very fragile economic circumstance, recovering from the deepest recession since the 1930s. This is not, if you listen to the economists, they will tell you this is not the time to have tax rates going up in this very fragile economic recovery that we are involved in right now. Again, take all the talking heads from the left and right and lock them in another room and listen to the business experts and the economists, and that is the consensus. So I'm very disappointed that they hadn't been extended a long time ago, because this expiration date was certainly a known entity for a long time. And people need to make planning decisions based on what the tax rates are going to be or not be. And right now nobody knows. I think at the end of the day they will be extended, whether it happens before December 31 or whether it happens after and it's retroactive to January 1. I think that it will happen. I think it's the right thing to do. In the longer run, I think we ought to take a hard look at our tax code, because it's too complicated, not particularly fair, and needs an overhaul. But we don't have time to do that right now. Our economy's in a tough situation, and we should take action to make sure tax rates don't go up.
You mentioned the fragile economic environment. It puts a great deal of pressure on our lawmakers to walk this fine line between stimulus and deficit reduction. Why don't you give our viewers a sense of how you make those calculations?
Sure.
In these choices between tax cuts that might add to the deficit in the short term, right, versus the deficit reduction that so many people see as necessary at this point.
Sure. A couple of issues in play in response to that question. The first is, in terms of the fragile economy in general, I don't think the government should be trying to manage the economy anyway. So we have to be careful about thinking that the government can just take some quick action and fix everything in terms of our economy. That's not the way our economic model is structured in this country, and so I think we should have appropriate expectations about what government can and should do and what it should not be doing. That's the first just general statement I make about how we should view the economic circumstances we're in right now with the fragile economy. Secondly, I think that it's very important to look at short-term and long-term issues when you are talking about state of the economy today, deficits over the long term. I think that anytime you have a challenge of the magnitude of the fiscal imbalances that our federal government faces over time, you need to take a long-term view and recognize how serious they are, first of all. Because if you take the long-term view, it gives you a better picture. And it also helps, I think, give policymakers the right perspective in terms of how to solve those problems. The biggest issue that drives the long-term deficit or debt projections for our government is actually health care. Healthcare represents half the federal budget right now between Medicare and Medicaid and veterans health care. And if you really want to take a look out over the next whatever time horizon, it could be 25, 50, 75 years, we just can't sustain a situation where healthcare costs are growing at a greater rate than inflation. In my opinion, the new healthcare law did not address this issue. As a country, we are going to have to address this issue at some point. And while every dollar counts, every dollar matters in terms of deficits and debt, in my opinion, the healthcare cost growth challenge that this country faces really is, to use the cliche, it's the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to our deficit.
So you're on record as saying President Obama, or at least the health care bill that passed, signed into law by President Obama, won't bring down health care costs over the long haul. What is the next step in the next legislative session to try and address that? Can you address that through the legislation, or does it have to be a new piece of legislation? I mean, when I say legislation, I mean
sure,
regulatory kinds of decisions that are going to have to be made by the bureaus and the agencies, or do you have to actually go in and pass a new piece of legislation that bends that curve to bring down those costs?
I think that, first of all, this is a challenge that has many, many variables that have to be addressed if you really want to deal with the excessive healthcare cost growth in America. In my opinion, the new healthcare law seemed to be narrowly focused, even though it was a pretty substantial piece of legislation, narrowly focused within health insurance reform for the most part, instead of looking at the overall healthcare system.
And so arguing that if you could get individuals into health insurance, that would somehow over the long haul bring down costs.
Yeah, which I don't think it does. And I think that in fact there are more substantive issues we need to take a look at about the structure of our healthcare system today. We need to look at the fact that a third of all we do in our healthcare system in America is not medically necessary. That's a remarkably inefficient and wasteful set of circumstances. Over $800 billion a year, by the way. So we ought to raise issues of our doctors or hospitals or home health care providers involved in practicing defensive medicine. We ought to take a look at malpractice reform. The president said we should take a look at malpractice reform, but the new law didn't really do that. But it's not just that to fix the fact that we have procedures we don't need to be doing. The whole payment system is structured around the more you do, the more you make. And so it's a perverse incentive in our healthcare system. And finally, we have certain providers who are clearly outside of the statistical norm in terms of how many procedures they're billing Medicare for each month. And no one ever does anything about that. We ought to be finding out why when the average orthopedic surgeon does this many procedures and this guy is doing this many, we ought to ask that question, because that's what's driving, in my opinion, the overutilization of our system. And that's just one area of many. We ought to be looking at healthcare cost growth. We could talk about this for quite a while, but I would just submit to you that there are a lot of very tangible issues which aren't going to be easy to solve that just weren't addressed in the new healthcare law. And at some point, this country is going to have to face those.
Now, some people, some observers are talking about Republicans taking control of the House of Representatives in the upcoming midterm elections. Many of these individuals are running on a platform of repealing the health care legislation that was signed into law. Is that a workable solution to you? Do you believe in repeal of the law, or is it really something that has to be built upon?
Well, I think that it's actually, there may be some good things in the law and there may be some bad, and there are, I shouldn't say maybe, there are some good things in the law and there's some bad things in the law. So I think, and on balance.
And some of those bad things in the law you can actually take care of through regulatory
I think it's going to require legislation. I actually think it will. And also the law in general just doesn't address a number of issues that need to be addressed. But I think we have to be careful about simplistically saying just repeal it and do nothing.
Right.
You have to offer a solution, because the path this country is going on in terms of the excessive cost growth is simply not sustainable. Not just in terms of the federal budget deficit, but private sector as well. Our businesses in this country are burdened with rising health care costs such that right now we pay half again more than any other country in the world. And in a global economy, we are placing our businesses at a competitive disadvantage with that cost structure. So we're all in this together in terms of facing this challenge and needing to face this challenge in terms of healthcare cost growth. And in my opinion, we should keep the good aspects of the bill, get rid of the bad ones, and also expand the playing field in terms of a lot of other issues we ought to be working on in healthcare.
All right, well, let's once again assume that Republicans do win control of the House in these upcoming midterm elections. How will that change what you do and how you do it? You come from a district that is mostly Republican. A large majority of voters self-identify themselves as Republicans. Does that change your representational style in any way, or how you seek to get things done in Congress?
Actually, it doesn't change anything at all. I mean, I have been in Congress, I've been in the minority and the majority, and I've always used the same approach anyway, which is I always try to build bipartisan coalitions. I always try to work on substance instead of politics, and generally that's served me very well. So that wouldn't change my approach at all.
A lot of the criticism of Congress that it's too quick to bring back federal dollars to Washington, D.C. Why don't you lay out your philosophy for the relationship that exists between states and federal funding of various projects? You've been quite successful at bringing some of these projects back to the state of Utah, the St. George Airport in particular.
Sure.
What's that relationship between government and business, and what's the proper role that government plays in business?
Well, I think this is always an important discussion to have about what is an appropriate role and what's not appropriate. I think that there's a recognition that there's certain functions in society where the government probably is the right entity to take them on. An obvious one's national defense. I think that that's a role of our government. It isn't something you would farm out in the private sector, although there is some excessive amount of contracting to do that. Roads, bridges, transportation infrastructure, same thing. There are appropriate roles. There are other areas where government can go too far. And I'm not sure if you're asking me about earmarks. Your question was a little broad, so I'm
not specifically about earmarks, because a lot of this could be done without earmarks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the St. George Airport was not an earmark. Right. It was through a competitive grant, and the Federal Aviation Administration made a decision to invest in that airport. And it's going to be a big deal for southern Utah. It's a big economic driver for generations to come. And people in St. George are very happy about getting that airport. Right. And it happens to be federal dollars that are paying for the vast majority of it.
Right. So there is kind of an earmark way of doing it, and people have talked about earmark reform. Where do you stand on earmark reform? Well,
there have been some reforms so far in earmarking. The fact of the matter is that it ought to be a very transparent process, and it ought to be where you have no personal financial interest in it. Right now, with the reforms that have taken place in Congress, any request I make for an appropriations earmark, I have to sign a letter verifying I have no personal financial stake in any of this. The House of Representatives actually made the decision it should only be for public sector entities and not private sector. And it ought to be very transparent. Every earmark request ought to be put up on the internet, which it is now, and it ought to be up for a vote where anything could be stripped out of a bill at any time. You know, the earmark that I think really got everyone's attention, and it was really outrageous, was the bridge to nowhere in Alaska. That was never in either the bill that the Senate or the House passed. So we never had a chance, either body, to have an amendment to take that project out of the appropriations bill. It's after the House and Senate passed their own bills and they're working out what's called the conference report, where you combine them together for one final bill. Someone dropped that in then. That practice should be eliminated. It's still allowed under the rules of Congress, but to me, if you want to reform earmarks, make it where it's all transparent in the light of day and everybody's got a chance to vote on it. That's the way you build integrity back into the process.
You talked about one of the proper roles for the federal government being national defense. That gives us a chance to talk briefly about the war in Afghanistan. Where do you think it is? What's the timetable for withdrawal? Is President Obama still on schedule for his August withdrawal that he's been talking about? And is Congress capable of kind of exercising the oversight necessary to make sure that the billions and billions of dollars that Americans have spent on that are not being wasted?
Well, let's face it, it's an unbelievably complicated circumstance, and the news reports are mixed. I think anyone would be overstating if they said that things are going great. You know, the president has maintained his commitment on Iraq to reduce all the combat troops, and he did, and there are no combat troops left in Iraq. There are 50,000 support troops there. He has come up with a plan to pursue strategies in Afghanistan that entailed a ramping up of troops and then a drawdown in 2011. From all that I have heard, that is still in process, and there's no plan I've heard of to deviate from that proposal. I think most people in Congress, quite frankly in both parties, feel like having a plan in Afghanistan, which quite frankly was lacking for several years, is actually a good thing. I think most people in Congress are nervous about what's going on in Afghanistan because it is such a difficult challenge to see tangible progress. But I don't see a big effort in Congress on either side of the aisle to do a significant change in terms of what's going on in Afghanistan right now. I think people are going to say there's a plan in place, we'll see where we are in 2011. I think there's pretty much a wait-and-see attitude.
Okay. Last question. What do you think is the greatest joy or benefit from serving in the House of Representatives?
For me, it's been the opportunity to meet a remarkable number of wonderful people in Utah. I get a chance to meet people, maybe a lot of business owners, people in university settings, people working for nonprofits who are doing very positive things within their community. And I never would have met them if I wasn't a member of Congress. And you never hear about it because the newspapers only report about the car crashes and the bank robberies. It seems like it's only bad news that gets reported in the press. But there are so many positive and good things happening in our state and so many good people. And I'm really feel enriched as a member of Congress that I've had a chance to meet so many of them and get engaged in what they're doing. And it really gives me a very optimistic view of the future because I know there's so many good people in our state doing so many good things.
Thank you very much, Representative Matheson.
Okay, thank you.
Well, granted, Jim Matheson has been very popular in Utah, but this is an anti-incumbent year, especially anti-incumbents with Republicans against Democrats that hold the major offices.
Right. There's a strong national tide that seems to be moving for the Republicans. I think the reason why it's moving for the Republicans is because the Republicans aren't in office. There's great deal of frustration with Washington, D.C. and what it's been doing, a great deal of anxiety about the economy. People tend to take out their frustrations, their anxiety on the party in power. So that creates a real problem, a real challenge for Representative Matheson as he kind of walks this fine line between appealing to the moderates and the Democrats in his district, but still trying to get the people out to vote that he needs to vote for him.
Even though he still holds a 2-to-1 edge in the polls, we can see that maybe there is just a little bit of concern there in the fact that
you mean his favorabilities, right? We were talking about 2-to-1 edge in his favorabilities.
But we see this, that Jim Matheson is running as attacking Morgan Philpot. This is a little unusual for him.
Well, it is. I think it shows that it's a tough campaign environment for incumbents all around the United States, and that there are going to be incumbents who are having difficult races, who didn't know that they were going to be in difficult races until right up until the last day. There are still 70, 80, 90 races out there where people know that they're already in very difficult races. But if it's a big enough tide, that expands into triple digits. So election night on November 2nd, 2010 is going to be, I think, historic for a number of reasons.
Well, in the time remaining, we want to talk about some more of the results from the KBYU Utah voter poll that we referred to earlier. Our survey asked likely voters about which candidate they support in the governor's race. Of course, this is a special election this year to fill the last 2 years of the term that was first occupied by Governor Huntsman. And incumbent Gary Herbert, who was the lieutenant governor under Governor Huntsman, leads by a 2-to-1 margin. Another question asked respondents was to rate Governor Herbert's job performance. Nearly 3/4 said they approved of the job that he is doing. Kelly, Governor Herbert would seem to have little to fear for his job security against Peter Caroon when voters go to the poll on Tuesdays.
Yeah, he has two advantages going for him. One, the overwhelming registration advantage that Republicans have in the state, and two, he's an incumbent, and he's had 2 years to make his mark and to get his name out among voters across the state, and that's a big advantage.
Well, in your poll, you also shared with voters a list of descriptive phrases and then asked them to say whether the phrase best described Governor Herbert or Mayor Caroon. And let's take a look at those phrases right now.
Yeah, I think the interesting number in that table is the 44% who think that it is ethical describes Gary Herbert. That's probably a little low and may have been driven down a bit by this campaign that Mayor Caroon has waged against Governor Herbert, calling into question his ethics with regard to bids and campaign finance and the like. You see the 60% who say his experience, that's that advantage of incumbency we were talking about. People have had 2 years to see him running the state. Then apparently they see that experience as something important.
Well, the KBYU Utah voter poll survey also asked respondents how favorably disposed they are toward some top political names in Utah. And this list is interesting to note that unfavorable views of Senator Hatch are getting as high as they are, and Senator Hatch faces re-election himself in 2 years.
I think once again his the favorability ratings of Senator Hatch show just how widespread this frustration with Washington, D.C. is. That frustration took out Senator Bennett earlier this year, and I think the favorables apply to Senator Hatch as well, who's been in Washington, D.C. a long time.
Let's move to the Senate race now. Bob Bennett, of course, not in the race because he was voted out in the convention. Democrat Sam Granado gets little support from the survey respondents in his race against Republican nominee Mike Lee, who is really a darling of the Tea Party. Yeah,
these numbers aren't much of a surprise and reflect the identification or registration that we see in the state that's overwhelmingly Republican as opposed to Democrat. That 60-30 ratio is what we normally see in these kinds of races statewide.
Sam Granado making a lot of waves, a lot of charges saying that he is mainstream, not extreme, but these polls would seem to indicate that he's not getting that kind of response from the voters that he would like to get.
Yeah, voters want to see change, and they can vote for change and vote for Republican in Mike Lee, and so it's going to be hard for Sam Granado to get much traction in that kind of an environment. Republican voters have had their fling with change, and they did that with Senator Bennett, and now they can vote for Mike Lee.
Kelly Patterson, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And it is time to leave you now with this reminder to join us on election night beginning at 6 p.m. And, of course, go out and vote. That's the most important thing. We will bring you election news and analysis until 10 o'clock. And at 8 p.m., when the voting ends, we'll release the results of the 2010 KBYU Utah Colleges exit poll. You'll get our predictions on who will win in the statewide, congressional, and a few select Utah legislative races. Then throughout the evening, we'll use that poll, results, to tell you what factors influence Utahns to vote the way they did. We'll see you again Tuesday night beginning at 6 p.m. Along with Kelly Patterson, I'm Wes Sims. Thanks for joining us. Good night.